we're going to go back a little bit to unravel some things. So our question of the Puritans and their sway when it comes to later on during Cromwell's rebellion and subsequent takeover of England, if you want to call it that. Well, I found something interesting here. It is a book called England's Story by Eva March Tappet. Okay. 1901 is the copyright here. That's the only date I see, so we're just going to say it's from around 1900. Now, there's a chapter in here that I'm going to read out about the beginning of the House of Stuart. Because as you remember, that's kind of when things started shifting in the 1600s. But before I begin that, I wanted to say one thing. Our search through Paradise Lost, as said before, is a search through the understanding of gods. We are starting in the 1600s and we're working our way backwards until we discover, until we fucking at least unravel the sketches, the ideas of how the gods were lost. I just figured the 1600s was a good place to start. So, I just want to get that out of the way. That's the point of the series that's happening here. We will continue to read Paradise Lost. We will continue to read the Bible and the New Testament and all that. But we're seeking to unravel all the damage done by time. So we'll get into this, then we'll go back to Bede, and we'll go back to that. You know, we're transitioning backwards, okay? Now, going forward, we want to understand the time in which Milton lived. And to get a better understanding of the, apparently I've seen the word Presbyterian Puritans in a fuller scope, okay? How they became what they became. Listen to this. James I, the heir to Elizabeth's throne, was James, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the child whom she had resigned her kingdom when she was a prisoner at Lochleven Castle. He was now nearly 40 years of age, and from his looks and manner, no one would have guessed that he was the son of Queen Mary. She was graceful and beautiful, and she had so much tact that almost everyone who met her liked her and was ready to do whatever she asked. James was awkward and clumsy, and made himself even more clumsy than he was by nature, because he was so afraid of being assassinated that he had his clothes heavily padded and quilted. He rolled from side to side when he walked. His tongue was too big for his mouth. He was coarse in his ways, and with all his delight in gorgeousness he took no pleasure in neatness and cleanliness. Just to give you an image. He had been brought up very strictly by the Scotch Presbyterians, who were far more rigid in their ideas than the Puritans. The Presbyterians believed, for instance, that it was very wrong for a clergyman to wear a white surplice when he preached, and they felt sure that a church governed by a presbyterian must be far better than one governed by bishops. That's that white cloak that they put over, I think, how does it describe it? A classical gown with wide sleeves worn over a cassock. That thing that the monks and the priests and bishops wear. It's like they put that white over it. You see the Catholics and shit do that. I don't know what it means, but I think that's what they're talking about. James had been taught but not educated. That is, he had been made to read and study so much that he knew many facts, but it would have been better if he had known only half as many and had reasoned and thought about them. He was so sure that he was a learned man that he was too conceited to be taught anything, and he never found out that knowledge is of no value unless one has learned how to use it well. The brilliant French minister, Sully, said that James was the wisest fool in Europe. So I just want to give you, that's the man that takes the throne after Elizabeth's death, which is like the ending, as I understand it, of the Tudor line, okay? The Tudor line's the one that really fucked everything up, but we'll get to that. Scotch rejoicings, that's a weird, okay. This was the man who now sat on the throne of England. He was the 6th king by the name of James who had ruled in Scotland, but the first of the name who had ruled in England. So in English history, he is always spoken as James I. The English were not especially eager to have him for king, but the Scotch were rejoicing, for they had never forgotten the stone of Scone that Edward I had carried to England 300 years before. And when James sat on the stone in the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey, the Scotch felt that at last a prophecy had been fulfilled, that wherever the stone rests, a Scotch man should rule. Now, this is the part that is fucking key to everything. That's a little backstory of like how we got to this point, and that is the year between 1603. That's describing that year, and in that year that man. So he ascended to the throne from Mary Queen of Scots, some 40-year-old guy. They're connected to the Tudors in their own way, right? And Elizabeth. This one's called Which Church? The first question in the minds of James' new subjects were which church he would favor. The Roman Catholics hoped that out of regard for his mother's beliefs, he would make a life in England easier for them. And the Puritans hoped that he had been brought up among Presbyterians. He would have a feeling of fellowship with them. 1,000 Puritan ministers at once presented him with the mammoth petition, asking that they might be allowed to preach without a surplice, that thing we said before, to marry couples without using a ring, and to baptize children without making the sign of the cross. It's kind of like pilly shit, but at that time it meant something. James called several of these Puritan ministers to meet an assembly of bishops to discuss the matter in his presence. He's like, you can talk, and the bishops can talk. Just as soon as he saw that some of the Puritans, as well as the Scottish Presbyterians, wished to have no bishops, he shouted, "No bishops, no king." And not an inch would he move from that position. For he believed that if they thought a church might be governed without bishops, they would next think a kingdom might be governed without a king. And he declared that both Puritans and Roman Catholics should conform to the Church of England, or he would, quote, harry them out of the land, or else do worse. So he's threatening them to kind of conform away from their own stupid little belief systems. Naturally, the English bishops and most of the lords stood firmly by the king. And one of the lords who was at the conference said he was, quote, fully persuaded that his majesty spoke by the instinct of the Spirit of God, end quote. At this meeting, no one really ventured to speak with perfect freedom except the king, and he was so delighted to have so fine an opportunity to display his knowledge that he forgot he was acting as a judge who should listen and not argue. And he himself monopolized the speech-making. He quoted Latin and he quoted Greek, and he closed the conference with the satisfied conviction that if the Puritans were not converted from their mistaken ways, they ought to be. The one good that came from this convention was a new translation of the Bible. This was complete in 1611 and is one now in common use, the King James edition. Let there be no mistake, essentially, is what I'm hearing. And that, right there, begins the downfall of, well, I mean, the monarchy as it was going along at that point, but at the same time, it was the rise of this Puritan movement. So that was in like 1603 to 1605. Let's do a little bit of looking here on something. So just in summary, as everything that led up to the point of the reign of Queen Elizabeth's, heir, I guess you could say. Remember, Mary Queen of Scots' son? Anyway, we'll just summarize it like this. The Church of England was founded in the 16th century, most likely by King Henry VIII. Remember the reasoning behind that? The whole, like, Reformation Act, the breaking from the church. He wanted to divorce, what was her name? It was, I think it was Catherine of Aragon. He wanted a divorce from her. The Pope said no, and he said, well, fuck the Pope. You've seen the Tudors, the movie, right? Or the series on HBO. that was kind of the supposed, said, at least that's as far as I could see, founding of the Church of England. And we have this creation where they were Protestant, but I saw things about Anglicans and shit. I don't really know a lot of that quite yet. Another thing we found during that time was the Act of Supremacy, which is the king is the head of the church. In simple terms, the king's greater than the Pope. I'm thinking that breaking from the Catholic control thing is where it starts to happen. Once we go back in time, we'll see, like, remember I was telling you about Bede and all that stuff, and how he was describing the Christianization of England and all that. And you had the Pope sending all these bishops over and kind of constantly forcing them to accept this religion for whatever fucking reason. I think that has a lot more to do with the control than it does an actual, you know, a faith-based thing, even though it can hide inside of that. I think there's something higher to this, consciousness-wise. But we'll get to that eventually. But just know, this is at this point they really try to break from that control of this weird Roman Catholic fucking thing. Now, during Elizabeth I's reign, Catholics were subject to laws that restricted their rights and imposed penalties for practicing faith. At least that's what I've seen so far. To understand that, that's what's going to happen going forward. So from the 1500s all the way to where we're talking about now, from 1600s into like the late, before the killing of the king, we're starting to see a powder keg. This is the creation, just in this regard here, of the religion in England. But there were some more things going on. Let's try to get into that. Now, Bacon seemed to be signaling a sort of new, I don't even want to call it that necessarily, a new era of philosophical thinking on the backs of like what came before. So like classical philosophy, like, you know, like Plato and Aristotle and this like those old school things. And then we're coming out of this Renaissance era. And as I'm looking here, the Renaissance humanism, the movement in the Renaissance which emphasized the importance of individual agency, education, and the study of classical texts. So we're already starting to see humanism, I think that's what it would be termed as, really influencing individuality and really starting to influence the idea of, well, determining free will in and of itself and subjectivity. We're really starting to get the idea of human beings really breaking apart from each other, not like they weren't before, but they're more so now. Also, I'm looking here, and modern thinkers, Bacon was influenced by the emerging scientific and philosophical ideas of his time. He engaged with the works of contemporary scholars such as Galilei, Johannes Kepler, whose contribution to astronomy and the scientific method influenced his own thinking on empirical inquiry and the systematic study of nature. His education, career in law and politics also shaped his thinking. His experience as a lawyer and a statesman informed his understanding of governance, justice, and the relation between knowledge and power. His observations of the workings of the legal system and the political establishment contributed to his critical perception on the limitations of the traditional knowledge system. So, coming from before his time, we have influence that was heavily like the classical philosophers, right? You know, Stoicism, Aristotle, and fucking, I don't know, all that shit. We haven't even gotten to that yet. We will eventually. But also the humanism that became seemingly popular in the Renaissance era. On the backs of that, we have the early modern thinkers of the scientific method. And I think this reading here might be the best way to approach how Bacon was beginning to influence his time. Not like he was the only one, because there was other ones, but I think reading this next story can really show the shifting of consciousness of man. So let's get into the reading. Now, this was written in 1603 by Francis Bacon. I have no idea what we're going to uncover, but let's find out. Oh man. This is about the time of his ascension in 1603. Believing that I was born for the service of mankind, and regarding the care of the commonwealth as a kind of common property, which like the air and the water belongs to everybody, I set myself to consider in what way mankind might be best served, and what service I was myself best fitted by nature to perform. Now, among all the benefits that could be conferred upon mankind, I found none such great as the discovery of new arts, endowments, and commodities for the bettering of man's life. For I saw that among the rude people of the primitive times, the authors of rude inventions and discoveries were consecrated and numbered among the gods. And it was plain that the good effects wrought by founders of cities, lawgivers, fathers of people, extirpers of tyrants, and heroes of that class, extend but over narrow spaces and last but for short times. Whereas the work of the inventor, though a thing of less pomp and shew, is felt everywhere and lasts forever. But above all, if a man could succeed, not in striking out some particular invention, however useful, but in kindling the light of nature, a light which should in its own very rising touch and illuminate all borders, regions that confined upon the circle of our present knowledge, and so spreading further and further, should presently disclose and bring into the sight all that is the most hidden and secret in the world, that man, I thought, would be the benefactor indeed of the human race, the propagator of man's empire over the universe, the champion of liberty, the conqueror and subduer of necessities. For myself, I found that I was fitted for nothing so well as for the study of truth, as having a mind nimble and versatile enough to catch the resemblance of things, which is the chief point, and at the same time steady enough to fix and distinguish their subtler differences, and being gifted by nature with the desire to seek, patience to doubt, fondness to meditate, slowness to assert, readiness to reconsider, carefulness to dispose and set in order, and as being a man that neither affects what is new nor admires what is old, and that hates every kind of imposture. So I thought my nature had a kind of familiarity and a relationship with truth. It's the beginning of searching for truth. Nevertheless, because my birth and education had seasoned me in business of state, and because opinions, so young as I was, would sometimes stagger me, and because I thought that a man's own country has some special claims upon him more than the rest of the world, and because I hoped that, if I rose to any place of honor in the state, I should have a larger command of industry and ability to help me in my work. For these reasons I both applied myself to acquire the art of civil life, and commended my service, so far as in modesty and honesty I might, to the favor of such friends, and had any influence, in which also I have another motive, for I felt that those things I have spoken of, be they great or small, reach no further than the condition and culture of this mortal life. And I was not without hope, the condition of religion being at the time not very prosperous, that if I came to hold office in this state, I might get something done to good of men's souls. When I found, however, that my zeal was mistaken for ambition, and my life had already reached the turning point, and my breaking health reminded me how ill I could afford to be so slow. And I reflected, moreover, that in leaving undone the good that I could do by myself alone, and applying myself to that which could not be done without the help and consent of others, I was by no means discharging the duty that lay upon me. I put all those thoughts aside, and in pursuance of my old determination, betook myself wholly to this work. Not wholly, but with a W. Nor am I discouraging from it because I see signs in the times of the decline and overthrow of that knowledge and erudition which is now in use. So he's kind of mentioning maybe what's going on here with that Puritan, the Catholic thing going on in the king and all that junk we just read. Not that I apprehend any more barbaric invasions, unless possibly the Spanish Empire should recover its strength, and having crushed other nations by arms should itself sink under its own weight. But the civil wars which may be expected, I think, judging from certain fashions which have come in of late, to spread through many countries, together with the malignity of sex, and those compendious artifices and devices which have crept into the place of solid erudition, seem to portend for literature and in the sciences a tempest not less fatal, and one against which the printing office will be no effectually security. And no doubt but that fair weather learning which is nursed by leisure blossoms under reward and praise, which cannot withstand the shock of opinion, and is liable to be abused by tricks and quackery, will sink under such impediments as these. Far otherwise it is with that knowledge whose dignity is maintained by works of utility and power. For the injuries therefore which should proceed from the times, I am not afraid of them, and for the injuries which proceed from men I am not concerned. For if any one charges me with seeking to be wise over much, I answer simply that modesty and civil respect are fit for civil matters. In contemplation nothing is to be respected but truth. If anyone calls me out on my work, and that presently, I tell him frankly, without any imposture at all, that for me, a man not old or of weak health, my hands full of civil business, entering without guide or light upon an argument of all other the most obscure, I hold it up to have constructed the machine, though I may not succeed in setting it on work. Nay, with the same candor I profess and declare that the interpretation of nature, rightly conducted, ought, in the first steps of the ascent upon a certain stage of generals, be reached, to be kept clear of all applications to works. And this has in fact been the error of all those who have henceforth ventured themselves at all upon the waves of experience, that being either too weak of purpose or too eager for display, they have all at our outset sought prematurely for works, as proofs and pledges of their progress, and upon that rock have they been wrecked and cast away. If again anyone asks me, not indeed for actual works, yet for defined promises and forecasts of the works that are yet to be, I would have him known that the knowledge which we are now possessed will not teach a man even what to wish. Lastly, though this is a matter of less moment, if any of our politicians who use to make their calculations and conjectures according to the persons and precedences must need interpose his judgment in a thing of his nature, I would be remind of him how, according to the ancient fable, the lame man keeping the course won the race of the swift man who left it, and that there is no thought to be taken about precedences, for the thing is without precedents. Interesting. Now for my plan of publication, those parts of the work which have had it for their own object to find out and bring into correspondence such minds as are prepared and disposed for the argument, and to purge the floors of men's understandings, I wish to be published to the world and circulate from mouth to mouth. The rest I would have passed from hand to hand, with selection and judgment, not but I know that it is an old trick of impostors to keep a few of their follies back from the public, which are intended no better than those they put forward. But in this case it is not imposture at all, but a sober foresight, which tells me that the formula itself, interpretation, and the discoveries made by the same, will thrive better if committed to the charge of some fit and selected minds, and kept private. This, however, is other people's concerns. For myself, my heart is not set upon any of those things which depends upon external accidents. I am not hunting for fame. I have no desire to be found a sect, after a fashion of heresiarches, and to look for any private gain from such an undertaking as this, I count both ridiculous and base. Enough of me the consciousness of well-deserving, and those real and effectual results which fortune itself cannot interfere. That's called The Interpretation of Nature, 1603. So, as you can kind of see, Francis Bacon, he's really advocating the idea of man, what he's coining nature is of his own mind and obtaining his own information and trying to find his own way of navigating into that life, if you want to say it that way. the interpretation of nature. And he's basically saying that, you know, being in the civil life, having himself, that if I came to hold an office in the state, I might get something done for the good of men's souls. I have a job I must do it, and I do it well. This is kind of promoting the idea of man thinking for himself, it sounds like. Okay? Christ alive. Now, at the same time, a couple years later, in 1605, we have what's considered the Gunpowder Plot. And a guy named Guy Fawkes. I'm sure you guys heard of that. I wanted to lay that out there, and we're going to get into this plot here, and then we'll slowly ease our steps into the next part. The Gunpowder Plot. People were no longer burned for heresy, but both Roman Catholics and Puritans were heavily fined and imprisoned, and even tortured, and treated in all ways with greatest unfairness and severity. In a kingdom in which every man belonged to one of three religious parties, a king who was so unjust of the two of these parties must expect that in one or the other there would be men that would conspire against him. This was soon the case in England. The Puritans could become members of Parliament and could sometimes find redress of their grievances and legal measures. But the oath that every member of the Parliament must take was one that no Roman Catholic could honestly repeat. Therefore, it was naturally among the Roman Catholics that the most notorious plot was formed. This plot was a scheme to blow up the Parliament House with gunpowder. A cellar under the building was rented. A great quantities of powder were stored there, hidden under wood and coal. It was arranged that on the day of the opening of Parliament, one man should slip into the cellar and light the pile. The conspirators hoped that the king, nobles, and bishops would be destroyed in a moment. They had a long time to wait, since on the ground or another, the opening of Parliament was put off for a year. That so terrible a secret could be kept by a group of men so long a time. They had so long a time to wait, since on the ground or another, the opening of Parliament was put off for a year. That so terrible a secret could be kept by a group of men so long a time showed to what desperation they had been driven. At last, however, the time came. The day was set on which Parliament should convene. The hopes of the conspirators rose higher, for they believed that soon their enemies would be destroyed. At the last moment, the heart of one of the conspirators failed him. Hundreds of women throughout England might lose husband, or father, or brother, but his sister's husband must be saved. He sent a note of warning. Some say that it was read aloud by mistake and straightway reported to the council. Others say that he was repented for the fearful scheme and thought that this sending of an anonymous letter would be the best way to reveal the plan and prevent the slaughter. In the letter of warning was an expression suggesting that the danger would be sudden. It is said that King James himself was one who interpreted this as meaning that gunpowder would be used. The councilors were even chosen guardians of the secret. Oh my Christ, I hate how I read. The councilors were even closer guardians of the secret than the conspirators had been. Arrangements went on for the opening of Parliament. Just before midnight of November the 4th, the day before the explosion was to have taken place, the Lord Chamberlain and his attendants went to the cellar under the building, and there stood a tall man in whose possession were slow matches and touchwood. This was Guy Fawkes, who was to touch off the powder. He refused to reveal the names of his associates, but after terrible tortures in the tower, he yielded. This plot was known only by a few men, but in the minds of the public, the blame was thrown upon all the Roman Catholics, and the laws against them became more rigorous than ever. The 5th of November, 1605, was the day appointed for the explosion. It is still called Guy Fawkes Day, and the old rhymes are not yet forgotten. Blah, blah, blah. So we're getting into the idea, that was just the Roman Catholics and the shit that they fell Now, I mean, why are we doing this? But you can kind of see the beginnings of this powder keg thing. Where this king here, this newly appointed king, is really creating a divide between people, which was already there, but now it's even more so. And now the Roman Catholics are fucking pissed off, and now the Puritans are pissed off, and he's this wedge. And the way it described him as, earlier, as kind of being this learned man, or at least self-proclaimed learned man, but he didn't have any knowledge. He knew of many things, but he didn't know how to use that knowledge. Suggesting that before him was the answers of fixing the problem, but instead he created the divide. Now, this part here, that's what was holding the spine together in the back. The divine right of kings. During his whole reign, James' favorite idea was the divine right of kings. He believed that no matter how bad a man was, God had appointed him to rule, if he was only the oldest son of the preceding sovereign. And no Christian could rightfully oppose him, if anything, that he should choose to do. In early days, the English people had made the man king who seemed to be best able to rule. They then began to prefer that the same family should continue in power. But they chose among the members of the family the one that seemed to be worthiest of the throne. Gradually they had come to feel that it was wiser to choose the oldest son or his descendants, but to have been told that this oldest son was invariably one of the chosen of God to rule them, and that the nation had nothing to do with the matter but to accept and obey whatever laws he wished to make. So, I think that's perfectly stating where we're going to. What we previously said, that the idea that this King James here, the first, is laying out, in which what I echoed my speculation in the last episode, it's saying, hey man, like, this is God, this is not you. And then we're going to have this transition, of God and man. Behind this wall, this monarchy, God is appointing them. Through God, through him, the consciousness of man can grow. We're going to see it kind of shift the other way. And that's why we're kind of keeping Francis Bacon in our, So yeah, we read in his work called The Interpretation of Nature in 1603, believing I was born for the service of mankind and regarding the care of the commonwealth as a kind of common property which, like the air and water, belong to everybody, I set myself to consider in what way mankind might be best served, and how I may best serve them. He's already beginning the idea. It's about the individual man. It's about him thinking for himself and determining what his life is and walking themselves away from the idea in which the Puritans echo. In which the Puritans are echoing the idea of, yes, there is a free will, but we must be judged upon blah, blah, blah. Our own pure self-purity, or like the shit like that we feel and think, and probably shunning things like certain sexualities and blah, blah, blah. They're agreeing to it themselves, but in that they're using the image of God to be the casting of their demise, like their kind of their judgment. And he's saying, yes, we do have individual freedoms, I think, but we can determine that from with ourselves, and we must look at things without this veil of religion above our eyes. And those things were kind of being born in this century from what was happening with this king here, who walked right into the fucking English public face and said, yeah, there's a divide here between the religion. And, well, I don't really like the Roman Catholics, and the Puritans I'm not a big fan of myself. And I'm going to publicly say that. And now I'm creating enemies. And now we have the Roman Catholics getting mad, and so they try to blow up fucking Parliament with this fucker named Guy Fawkes. And then you probably have the Puritans later doing something else. Meanwhile, he's like, yes, and I am God's king, and God himself derives from me. But, it's crazy to think of, yeah, this time is starting to get a little bit fucky. So I just think that's another thing to keep in mind as we're reading on with the book. Another addendum. It is interesting to kind of get a perspective here. It really is. But again, we're moving our way backwards. We're going to get to the source of religion, for at least as much as we can. Let us lay that out on the board. Does black work? I don't remember. We have 1603. We have King James the First, who came from the Tudor line. We're just going to put up here. I don't remember how to spell Tudor. Tutor, U-R. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. The Turd line. He ascended to the throne from Queen of Scots, or whatever, Mary Queen of Scots, the sister of Elizabeth, you know. He came into the throne, about 40s, I think it said he was. And then what he did was, like, they kind of got together, Parliament. It's like, yeah, there's the Puritans, and then there's we'll just call them the RCs, the Roman Catholics, so don't write it all out. And there was this big divide, and they're like, you should fucking want us, you know? Like, yeah, let's celebrate. Let's be together. We got our dinks going. Let's celebrate here. And the Roman Catholic's like, well, this is the opportunity for you to say, hey, remember your mother was a Roman Catholic like us, and that was the whole weird thing going on with her and Elizabeth. You should come back to that because your mom. And they're like, no, you should go to that idea that you were raised in by the Scotch Presbyterians. Like, let's do this. And he's kind of like, fuck you and fuck you. We want bishops, and we want the Roman Church. Sorry, not the Roman Church. We want the English Church. Both of you need to fall in line. And they're like, oh, man. And so, going forward, that created a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. Then, the Roman Catholics were so mad that they wanted to blow up fucking Parliament to prove a fucking point. I don't know what they thought that this would do, but they felt that threatened by it. Meanwhile, the Puritans themselves were, it sounds like they could get in Parliament, but they had to renounce certain parts of themselves, and they didn't like that, and some of them were tortured, and some of them didn't, blah, blah, blah. Like, there was no more burning at the stake, but there definitely was people getting tortured. So they're all pretty pissed at James the First. What does James the First do, though? He's like, dude, me, James, I come, why did I spell it like that? I come from God's choice. God himself has announced me and my presence into this area. And I'm, you know, it is not about the people, it is about God and me and this and that. And everyone's like, that shit's going on. Meanwhile, we have this fucking man that's just hanging out named Bacon. Around that time, he was advocating the study of nature and how man can use himself, at least he himself, and obviously he wanted to, you know, get other people on this shit. He wanted to say, hey, it's about self-obtainment. It's about bettering ourselves through the skills that which we have. We can use opportunities to better ourselves, but we need to think differently. We not get caught up in the dogmatic views of the ideas that were laid before us. A man should think for himself. I'm thinking, man, I don't know. I didn't really, when I read it out loud, I didn't retain it. So, but that's kind of what I'm getting from his works as a whole. I just imagined it was echoed there. It's kind of a short overview of what we're getting into once we start getting to the next 10 years of the 1600s, from 1610 on. But that's a quick little overview of where we're getting to and the world in which John Milton was coming around. What was happening to John Milton in 1603? Let's find out. So during this time, the early life and education of John Milton, Milton's paternal grandfather, Richard, was a staunch Roman Catholic who expelled his son, John, which is John's father, the poet's father, from the family's home in Oxfordshire for reading an English Protestant Bible. Banished and disinherited, Milton's father established in London a business as a scrivener, preparing documents for legal transactions. He was also a moneylender, and he negotiated with creditors for arrangements of loans on behalf of his clients. He and his wife, Sarah Jeffrey, whose father was a merchant tailor, had 3 children who survived their early years. Annie, the oldest, followed by John and Christopher. Christopher became a lawyer, a royalist, and perhaps a Roman Catholic. He maintained throughout his life a cordial relationship with his older brother. After the Stuart monarchy was restored, Christopher, among others, may have interceded to prevent the execution of his brother. That's getting later. John Milton, who fostered cultural interest as a musician and composer, enrolled his son John, that's the one we're talking about, at St. Paul's School, probably in the 1620s. So we're going to stop there because then it goes more into it. But at this time, he was coming to age. But all he ever knew, maybe, I mean, I don't know how well you talk about your family, is like your grandfather disowned your father because your grandfather was a Roman Catholic. And your father, according to this, read a fucking Bible, a Protestant Bible, whatever that even means. And so that right there has instilled itself into his mind. That's created, like as children, like those small things, like that might seem small to an adult. Like, I read this book and then she walked in and she got mad and I was like, oh, and then she divorced me. You'd be like, that's fucking weird. But as children, we have that staining our memory. So this divide between the Roman Catholics and this, which was, as it just described it as a Protestant Bible, whatever that even means, that could have made a giant impact on him. So while this world is happening, and the events we describe are just the major ones, there's probably a lot of other things going on, but those are the major things that we're seeing happen, you could understand the world in which he's coming up, which we're going to slowly creep into in time. I just thought I'd lay out the 2 people we're really following are John Milton, obviously, but quietly Bacon over here to get this other perspective. Now, I wanted to give you kind of an understanding, a little bit deeper understanding of the political atmosphere at the time. We'll see how that goes.